Hi, I'm Dr. Lissa Rankin, and I am delighted to be here today with Anke Richter, who's the author of Culty, and with Dr. Jeffrey Rediger, who's the author of Cured. And I'm Lissa Rankin. I'm working on my 8th book right now, and the three of us are going to be talking about some really important topics related to power dynamics in leadership, cults and cult recovery, narcissistic abuse and how that impacts our health, and just basically how do we deal with leadership, especially in arenas that are sort of ripe for abuse of power, like spiritual communities and self-help communities and things like that. So I'm aware right out of the gate that these are sensitive subjects for some of you all to talk about, things like spiritual abuse and narcissistic abuse and having power abused by somebody that you trusted who was maybe in a one-up position of mentorship or leadership or healing or medicine. And we're both doctors, so we're aware of that dynamic already in the medical space. And as authors, we're also aware of the power that we hold to have influence. So we're going to be talking about some of those issues. So welcome.
Thank you, Lissa. It's great to be in California again after all these years. It's my first time I'm actually here with my work, not as a journalist, but more with my book and my organization, Deconstructing. Been talking at the Lost Church on Thursday with a cult expert, Yanni Lalic, and with a cult survivor from Rajneeshpuram, Sarita Carroll. So that's what brings me here. And you're my first stop, really, and I'm super excited because the three of us met. Can we share
You
this?
have to tell.
Okay.
You have to tell.
We met, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, in the pools at Esalen, as you do, having some deep conversations about cut-proofing a group. And my ears perked up because at the time I was already working on my last book, Cut Trip, and was super interested in this whole topic of how can you be a spiritual teacher or a facilitator and do it more ethically than the ones that I've come across in my research. And I've also started running workshops, how not to start a cult is the name of my workshop. And some of what you've shared with me after Esalen and some other things I got from documents like Red Flags and Workshops is a great one. That has really informed my work as a workshop facilitator now who wants to inform others about cultic red flags.
Yeah, because you could make a cult about how not to start a cult. And in fact, many cult leaders, like kind of build it into their teachings. So it sounds like, oh, this person really cares about not starting a cult while they're starting a cult. So it's tricky, right? It's like, how do we actually not start a cult?
I've heard so many people in cultic groups claim that we're not a cult. I've never heard anyone saying, I think we are a bit culty. Or if they say it tongue in cheek and they think they think it sounds cool. I think One Taste did that. They always said, oh yeah, we are a cult. We're a cool cult.
I knew her. We were on a TV show together for my first book. I want to make sure we introduce Jeff before we get into our...
Yes, so we've got so much to talk about.
I know we do. Jeff, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, speaking of cults, it's a personal topic because I grew up in a very high control family and conservative Christian fundamentalist sect. My dad came out of the Amish tradition, and there's a lot of that's not known about what's true about that story from him, but it's certainly true that the situation was very high control. So I was like a bat out of hell when I had a chance to get out. I went to college and then went to seminary at Princeton to try to understand what I had come out of and to try to figure out what the hell had happened. And then once I cleared up enough of the dissociation, that sort of thing, I went on to medical school, and now I have been medical director at McLean Hospital in Boston for 22 years and a professor at Harvard Medical School, and recently have relocated to California. And so starting a new career there, and very interested in this kind of discussion about what it takes to recover from cultic abuse, spiritual abuse. How do you recognize the misuse of spiritual power? What is love bombing? That sort of thing. I mean, it's interesting to me that after all the spiritual study I've done, after all the years in seminary, and seeing lots of people with great spiritual power, there's never been one single discussion about how do you recognize the misuse of spiritual power or the relationship of that to
or
narcissism,
any kind of
for
power.
example, or any kind of power.
Yeah.
And that's in spite of the fact that, I was in a very, very well-respected academic program for
That's
spiritual
interesting.
training.
Wow.
So,
And the word cult it's not a popular one, I guess,
No.
in seminary or
no.
Harvard School of Divinity or so
Right.
on, right? It's a really contentious word, and it's this, I often call it the C word, right? But I
Right.
think we need to reclaim that word and use it for what what most people know it for, which means harmful, abusive, coercive groups or dynamics, or even family dynamics. And I know a lot of people call them high control groups or high demand groups, and often just to avoid the cult word because it also has a double meaning. Obviously, you could have a cult following, and so which already shows the whole spectrum of when does it flip over into something that's actually dangerous and harmful, and with Jonestown at the extreme end, and something less sinister in the middle, and that's probably where most of them sit, and then something that's really benign, but then there's some red flags, and when does it sort of flip over into something that we would call a cult, right? But it's not a word that people, I guess, in your field really like to use much, right?
That's right.
I'm curious too, like, is it even something you screen for? Probably not until recently, as a psychiatrist, when people are coming in as an inpatient at McLean,
No,
right?
and that's actually a really good question, because now I'm realizing that that people do come in and we don't screen adequately for these kinds of things, and sometimes people are misdiagnosed. And there's a lot to this, right? I mean, just to become more trauma-informed in general and start to understand that coercive control is really the umbrella for all kinds of abuse. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse.
Spiritual abuse.
I mean, coercive control really is kind of the umbrella, but most of us in psychiatry and medicine don't sit down and look for patterns of coercive control, which is a very different set of questions than, well, do you have a bruise?
Right.
It's so interesting because, I mean, from where I'm sitting in New Zealand, and I'm not an expert, I'm not an academic, I'm only a journalist who's spent many years mired in the aftermath of former sex cult and present one and so on, and basically learned a lot through that. But I've always looked at the States as where at least you have some people who are really cult informed as therapists, and they're teaching and training other therapists like Rachel Bernstein or Yanya, or she's not a Yanya Lala, she's not a therapist, but there are programs and trainings, and there's awareness. Whereas in New Zealand, and I guess in many other countries, we had none of those. And last year I became the convener of the first cult awareness conference in New Zealand called Decult. And
which has a podcast I've been listening to.
Yes, it's excellent.
It's excellent.
Right.
It's called Decult Talks, and it's so great.
You.
Yeah.
Really good interviews.
No, you did an amazing job curating the content, and the maturity and the depth of the conversations that were happening are just absolutely fantastic. So thank you for that.
Wow, that actually means a lot.
No,
because
really.
obviously I'm so close, and we took a risk because I would say half of the people who spoke at Decult had never gone public before, and they were cult survivors, and they were shitting themselves, and so was I, because we didn't know how they were. And they did a terrific job.
And we listened to every episode of
Yes.
Rachel Bernstein's Indoctrination, and a little bit Culty and Conspirituality, and so you did a great job, really.
And they
Thank you.
demonstrated a real interest in children who were raised in cults too, which is such an studied phenomenon.
That's I think it was the main focus of the conference was actually kids in cults. Our first panel was about that. Most of the speakers had been raised or born into cults. And it is, I think it's also the most burning topic in the whole canon of cultic abuse topics is the kids, right? And the ones who never even had a choice, and who never had a sense of self, and who have to it takes so much for them to basically reclaim their life. It's hard enough if you go into something at 25 and come out at 35
Right.
and realize you've been conned and brainwashed and believed in something that was completely bogus, and you don't know how to get your life back. But imagine you were born and raised. But what I wanted to say before with the cult conference, so our keynote, one keynote speaker was Janja Lalic from California.
She did a great job.
Great job. And the other one was Dr. Julie Jenkinson, who's a psychotherapist from the UK. And she actually brought cult recovery therapy to New Zealand. And after the conference, she trained over 80 mental health workers, practitioners, in her modality. And that's a great start. So I'm, and it just shows there's such a need. I can only speak for New Zealand, but I guess from what you're saying, this is across the board in mental health, that there are so many people who have come out of cults and they're not getting adequate help when they see a counselor or a therapist. And I've come across this again and again as an interviewer in my work as a journalist, that I've met former kids from cults, and their therapy experience or counseling experience was awful.
Yep.
They felt they had a voyeur on the other side, or they had someone who didn't get what religious trauma is or spiritual abuse. Then often, or especially if they come from a therapy cult, there was one in New Zealand that a big part of my book is about. Centrepoint was a human potential cult. Bert Potter, the cult leader, he came to Esalen and then went to Puna and sort of found his bearings there, and then brought all that to New Zealand. But it was also a sex cult where a large amount of the children were sexually abused. They took psychedelics together in experiments with the teens, and it was a massive, massive scandal in New Zealand. And those kids had therapy shoved down their throat in that cult. They hated the jargon. They were suspicious of
they had no
therapists.
trust.
They had no trust in therapy.
Right.
But and if you come out of a fundamentalist
That was
cult,
like my sister, who was in one of the troubled teen
Right.
cults, right? Where
So there's always
it's
that
therapy,
barrier.
it's rehab,
And then if you come out of a fundamentalist cult, often, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, therapy is from the devil too, because your faith is going to heal everything.
Right.
You're not going to go and see a doctor or especially a psychiatrist.
That's right.
If you've been in psychology and Scientology, psychiatrists are evil
bad
too.
news.
So there's all these hurdles already before you even go and see someone.
That's right.
And then if you've even made it into someone's room, if that person doesn't even understand what cultic abuse is and all of that, there's a lot to learn, eh?
Well, and
is.
there's so much we've been learning about dissociation and dissociative disorders.
Yeah.
And you were saying even at McLean, even at the #1 psych hospital in the world, they're not screening for dissociative disorders, right?
Right.
And somebody who's raised in a cult is almost guaranteed to have a dissociative disorder. Their parts are so blown apart, and there's so little access to that original authentic self. That they have an identity, often a dissociative identity disorder. They have an identity crisis. They don't know who they are. As you said, at least if somebody had a pre-cult identity, if you join a cult in college, you have 18 years, unless your parents were, a lot of people who joined cults young came from culty families, right? You don't have to go to some big program to have the same kinds of dissociative traumas that can happen in a narcissistic family system, where the cult leader is mom or the cult leader is dad and the kids are the cult followers, and you can have a cult of 4 or a cult of 2. So often the people that are attracted to some of those kinds of programs may have already developed that as their familiar. That's what's familiar, is somebody's the boss and you fawn the boss. So then they're primed to go into a dynamic where a cult leader is seeking to abuse their power.
And another aspect that I've heard a few times as well from people who've come out of cults, especially those who were born and raised, they said, if it's going to sound really hard to say, that someone says, I almost wish I could show a wound, or I would have the branding like an axiom, or I would have a sexual abuse, which unfortunately happens in most cults anyway, right? Very, very common. but if there's sort of none of those traumas that are more tangible and physical, it's so much harder to prove what especially the spiritual abuse, the moral injury is.
Yep.
Yeah. That is so much more complex. And I'm you guys are the experts here on this far more than I am, but I think it's really important that people work in mental health and in health in general, that they understand these concepts. And it saddens me that people who actually get in contact with the health system, and often that's involuntarily. Let's say they have an accident and they end up in hospital and they break a leg. This might be the first time in their life that someone truly cares for them selflessly, right?
Yep.
If they've come out of a closed cult community and they need to go and see, let's just say they're still in it or on the fringes of it, and they have to, for some reason, they end up in hospital. This could be life-changing for them.
And that is actually sometimes why people get out.
Exactly, right?
Yep.
So the difference it can make to actually have not just a trauma-informed, but a cult-informed nurse, doctor, psychologist, psychiatrist, pastor, whatever, there can make such a difference when someone gets where they can help the person with in the way that's not overreaching, that's not probing, that gives them, that respect for their worldview that's shifting. It's so complex. I mean, I have so much admiration for people who've come out of cults. I think it's one of the hardest things to tackle and overcome, and I guess it's a lifelong thing, right, Jeff?
Oh yeah, I mean, you
you
lose
that?
everything, right? You lose your community,
Yeah.
you lose your loved ones, and people will stay many times for years in a cultic situation because they might know or have a sense that there might be a big problem here, or they're just tired of working 18-hour days or whatever's going on, but they're terrified at the prospect of losing everyone they know and love. We are wired for attachment and for connection and relationship, and for that, to lose all of that and to not even have the normal background where you know how to get a job, or where you've finished school or have an education.
The lack of education, exactly. Of
massive.
life skills.
Of life skills.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't even know how to take care of yourself. So many end up homeless or scraping by, barely able to make it.
Prostitution and drugs.
Exactly.
Suicidal ideation. All these things are really high, especially
Sure
with
are.
kids from cults.
Sure are.
Yeah, one of the things he's
Yeah.
observed, because I'm a mother, my daughter's 19. She's going to be home from her gap year next Sunday. Can't wait. And then she starts art school in Brooklyn. And so he's watched the way we interact as mother and child, and that's included things like preparing her for leaving the home. Like, what are the life skills that you need to know before you leave the home? And I take these things for granted. My family taught me all these things. I knew that it was my responsibility, along with her dad, to teach her these things. So she's going out into the world, and part of why we encouraged her to do a gap year is because the pandemic kind of developmentally delayed some of that. Because for a lot of kids her age, she was in 8th grade when the pandemic hit and went to high school all on Zoom for the whole beginning of high school. So, those things we take for granted, and it gives those of us who didn't grow up that way, it gives us a massive privilege that we don't even think of as a privilege. And I know, like, one of the examples that you gave was, like, you went to kindergarten and all the other kids already knew the alphabet. And if nobody's teaching you the alphabet, you start off your education right out of the gate. If you're lucky enough, like you were, not to be homeschooled, not knowing, like, you already have a handicap. Yeah. Like the other kids have been watching Sesame Street or whatever, and they already know the alphabet.
You're like a refugee from another planet almost.
Yeah, it's a good analogy. You feel like you grew up on a different planet.
Right, but then you can't, it's not like people can just see that. You don't look for it. You speak the same language, you can put on their normal clothes. And I've especially found that with those who've left Gloria, so that's a fundamentalist cult in New Zealand. There's a great documentary about them now, and so it's one of the 3 groups that I spent a lot of time investigating, and I went in there twice. And I mean, you just said this about the alphabets. They don't have names for the days of the week or for the months. Wow. So you come out of there. I mean, first of all, you never used a credit card. You don't even know how to cook your own food, because if you just work a certain job and others work in the kitchen, and just basic life
Yeah.
skills, apart from all the other stuff, the indoctrination, as a woman to be so meek and have no aspirations, have no voice, just be there basically to serve men, also sexually. That's a heavy focus in there. So parallels to many other Mormon cults, fundamentalist ones in Christian, in the States. But this loss, this lack of life skills, of identity, of a voice, and then quite often, especially when those who come out as young, as maybe late teens or young adults, they often really go off the rails, completely lost. And then there's this sense of freedom they can't handle. I mean, when you're a teenager, you're already testing those
Right.
boundaries in a normal setting, in a normal family,
right,
You're a
right.
mother, I'm a mother,
Right.
But then with suddenly where we've been in such a construct and such a corset, and then you're out, and the world's your oyster, but also there it's like anything goes, and it's so heartbreaking sometimes to see where some of these former cult kids end up, and I have so much respect for those who, despite all this, despite the lack of what they were given, there's some of them have just become amazing advocates, writers, leaders in their own way. And those are the people some of them we brought to the Decart conference in New Zealand. And I was so lovely that you said this before, because I took a bit of a risk inviting people. I didn't know how they're going to cope. How is this going to come across? We had a session on IBLP there, a woman who was groomed by Bill Gothard,
Yep,
and
we had that training.
And also big respect to you. I'm curious though, did you become a cult hopper in some ways?
Yes.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
Tell us about that.
I laugh only because we've done so much deconstruction, breaking of the indoctrinations, but it's been like, wow. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I've done a lot of therapy, a lot of psychotherapy along the way. Part of my training, but also to just recover from the past, from childhood. And it wasn't enough, because talk therapy can't heal this sort of thing sometimes just by itself. And so that's been a lot to deconstruct. I mean, I used spirituality to basically batten down the hot hatches, really pile in the indoctrination in a lot of ways.
And
the conflict avoidance.
Enable the perpetrators.
To enable perpetrators, because the spirituality in the cultic situation is often about obedience and is militantly opposed to human rights, or to even allowing you to have your own feelings or experiences. And there's actually sometimes a very direct effort to separate you from your feelings, from the spidey senses in the back of your neck, and from your natural sense of what's right and wrong. I mean, all children have a kind of an innate knowledge of what's generally right and wrong, and that needs some cultivation and all that sort of thing. But when you're a child and in a cultic situation, there's active efforts to separate you from your natural knowing of what's right and wrong, so that then you don't fight back any longer.
You don't protest.
You don't protest any longer, and you just learn to obey. The IBLP cult with Bill Goddard is very much that way.
Didn't they have blanket training as well?
Yes,
Terrible.
my mom believed in that.
You want to describe blanket training for
Yes,
our...
it's
blanket training.
It's awful.
Torture.
It's awful.
It should
right?
be criminal,
Yes.
because the mother is taught to put a blanket on the floor and to put the young infant, 1 year old or so, on the blanket.
6 months.
6 months.
Right when they're just beginning to crawl.
Just when they're beginning to move and crawl and reach for things. But so the baby is put on the blanket, and then the edges of the blanket are considered the boundaries, and then a toy or a piece of food is held out to the baby, and of course the baby reaches for the food or for the rattle or the toy, and then they are disciplined when their arm reaches across that boundary. And so that's a really...
Discipline means being hit with something hard.
Yes, that's right.
They're little sticks and rulers, and they have tools for that, right?
They sure do.
Heartbreaking.
And it's heartbreaking because the child is taught to not want things.
Exactly. You're punished for wanting. You're punished for going after what's attractive to you.
Yes.
It's breaking your spirit before you even...
Yes.
That's right. That's what they call it, breaking the will.
It's called breaking the will.
Wow.
And that is the explicit efforts to break the will. And children are taught that they are bad and evil, and that their will needs to be broken. And so, and what that does is the child eventually doesn't even want things any longer. They're not going to reach for food or a rattle or a toy if they are going to get punished for it. And they learn to shut down their desires. They become docile, obedient children, and then are taught to be well-mannered. They're not well-mannered. Their will has been broken, and the people who teach this should be imprisoned.
Yes, I agree. Did you experience that as a child?
I did.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk? Is there anything you want to? I know you're in a process of coming out kind of about some of this stuff. Is there anything you want to share?
Oh, I think just I have a lot of respect for those who have come through this sort of thing. The techniques that are used in cultic relationships or cultic high control groups, they are very much about obedience, about using spirituality, turning it upside down so that it's only about conformity and obedience. What was your question again?
It's a difficult question. You don't have to answer.
What is it?
I was just asking, I know you're in a process of wanting to go public with some of your story, and I'm just wondering whether your childhood story or the cult that you were in as an adult, is there any part of that story that you want to share?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you and I are writing Relation Sick, which is coming out in May of 2026, and it's about the effects of narcissistic oppression on people's bodies. And that's something you see a lot in these kinds of cultic or high control situations.
Well, there's so much to talk about, and this was a great beginning.
Yeah.
We have a lot more ideas of things that we want to discuss, and I'm really enjoying being here with all of you. So we're going to take a little break, and we're going to keep filming some other topics. And thank you so much for being with us again, Dr. Lissa Rankin,
Anke Richter,
Dr. Jeff Rediger.
and we know that this is sensitive material, so again, our hearts really go out to all of you. If this is bringing up anything, we'll just take a deep breath and calm our nervous systems a little bit, and we'll be back with you in another video soon.